Hello everyone, I'm Captain Foley.
And I'm, of course, Commander Cockins. Today we have a rather interesting episode of Trekyards. There isn't a whole lot of information, or this is a long script actually, well done Stuart, per se, so it's made turn into more of a discussion piece between the captain and myself. But I think there's quite a lot to discuss really, Stuart.
Yeah, that's right actually. I wrote this first part before I really got in depth into it, but yes, I did find a lot of information, so ignore that last part about there wasn't a lot of information.
It's a good one, guys. If you'd like what we're going to talk about, and you know we are from the header. Yeah.
Yes. Anyway, today's topic delves into a slightly controversial topic in the Star Trek universe, and especially on the online forums, and that being fighters or fighter craft in Star Trek. Do they exist in Trek? If they do, why? There are a few that are in canon, of course, and a large number in games such as Starfleet Battles and Star Trek Invasion, etc., etc. But the big debate comes in when people ask, would fighters actually be even effective or practical in the Star Trek universe?
And that is actually not such a simple question. We both have seen this topic discussed many times online, including on the Trekyards Facebook group. And in this episode today, after we present some specific fighters we do know exist, we'll discuss the pros and cons of this debate and see what kind of solution, if any, present itself.
Yeah, it's a tough one, and it was actually a hard one to research. Like I said, I went into this thinking there wouldn't be much, and I found out. Well, you'll see, you'll see, hear, and enjoy. But anyway,
Classic Trekyard style.
Yes, but as the commander just said, let's talk about some of the more popular ones that we do know exist, and then we will see what we can come up with discussion-wise. Now, just for clarity, we will only focus on a few fighters from Trek in this episode. We don't want to water it down with the wide variety that present themselves from canon and side canon, but other more specific ones, or episodes discussing how they are used in games like Starfleet Battles, will likely come out in later episodes, or even in the form of a podcast discussion or something like that. But let's begin.
It's worth pointing out these will be primarily Federation fighters, because like I say, don't water it down with all the various ones. There are still quite a few Federation. But let's begin with the TOS era, as there are a number of early fighter designs in many different forms of media over the years. So some great TOS designs that we'll show some pictures of here, but not really discuss as the information is rather limited. However, there's one we do know a lot about, and most of the information comes straight out of the Jack Hill's Guide to Light Attack Craft. And what is that book, Stuart?
It's one of the older books from the 80s, came out around the FASA time period. There was 3 of them, I believe. Yeah.
Cool. The Federation did have a TOS era fighter known as the Argus class, which is listed as model type ARG 124, and so for many years until the use of fighters in the Federation was discontinued, presumably around the Star Trek the Motion Picture time frame. The Argus class, during its service, was quite effective. These fighters filled the roles of interceptor, warp pursuit craft, that sounds cool, long-range attack, and light patrol duties. The ship had a total length of 24.4 metres, a height of 4.4 metres, a width of 23.4 metres, and the vessel weighs in at just around 22.7 metric tons.
Powered by an advanced microfusion reactor that had a lifespan of around 5 years. The ship's physical appearance was very blocky and is shaped very much like a very slender shuttlecraft. But the ship is not designed to carry passengers, but instead is a photon torpedo and phaser platform. The height of the fighter includes the landing gear, and the fighter would be much smaller if the landing gear were not actually included. The pilot and the co-pilot sit forward in the fighter, but enter through the door in the side of the craft. A small compartment in the back of the ship has all the supplies and equipment required by the crew.
And while the fighter was not capable of a high warp speed, like most larger ships, the ability of the fighter to travel at warp speed, however, allow it to make strikes beyond the star system it initially launched from or stationed in. However, due to the space taken up by the warp system, the ship had less powerful shields and armour than the ship could normally carry, due to the restricted room which could normally accommodate more powerful shield generators.
The fighter is well armed and carries a twin-barrel light phaser cannon in the nose, which has a range of around 2,000 kilometers in space and 20 kilometers in an atmosphere, and a very compact photon torpedo launcher located on the underside of the craft. These launchers can fire either full-sized photon torpedoes or can be fitted to carry smaller micro-torpedoes. Only 2 full-size torpedoes or 6 micro-torpedoes could be carried at any one time. The larger torpedoes allow the fighter to damage much larger ships, such as cruisers.
Eventually, the runabouts... Now I start having my Eaglemoss models. Eventually, the runabouts, I had to do it, were considered to be the replacements that fill the role of this attack craft, but they provide far more expensive and required larger crews to operate as effectively. However, many of these craft still remain in service to act as training craft for atmospheric flight training and other small craft for pilot training. A large number were placed in storage, however, and used for extra parts and such for many, many years after. However, as an emergency measure, some of these fighters were actually restored to active service with some upgraded equipment at the start of the war with the Dominion. While the loss of these fighters was enormous, they did help hold the line until the Paragon Warp Fighter had completed trials and entered full service. More on that later.
Right now. Speaking of the Paragon Fighter, let's talk about that now.
I have the new Eagle Muscle as well. I'm so happy.
Yay. As stated, the Federation had sort of leaned away from the use of fighters for many years, and it wasn't until just prior to the Dominion War that they actually considered perhaps reintroducing them into the fleet in any substantial capacity. The Borg had destroyed many Federation vessels, and they needed ships to take up some of the burdens placed on the larger remaining ships. They wanted a vessel that could be rapidly produced. The old Argus-class warp fighter was far too old to fill the role, and the new runabouts were far too general purpose and, as you said, expensive to build.
For this reason, a new warp fighter was developed to replace all the older Federation fighters, including both warp-capable and non-capable fighters. So, design and development began on the PWF-12A. Okay. Several prototypes were stolen, however, by the Maquis, where they were adapted and fitted with various weapons that were available to the Maquis at the time. The ship performed well against the Cardassians. However, some people suspect that in reality, these ships were given to the Maquis by Federal intelligence in an attempt to actually test the ship in action before all final field trials were actually completed, in an attempt to speed up the process. It is believed these designs were in fact earlier, smaller, less capable versions of the ship, and once results from engagements with the Cardassians were based on Maquis encounters, the Federation scaled up the final Paragon to make it more battle-ready and improve the final design.
Luckily, just as the Federation went to war with the Dominion, the Paragon-class fighter was ready to enter into full production. In a few of the early battles, the Federation was forced to use some older fighter designs, however, as we mentioned earlier, that didn't hold the line. Well, they held the line, just not very well. They got destroyed. The Paragons entered the war and fought hard. Some were assigned to stations, others to Akira-class cruisers, while others were stationed on makeshift carriers that had been converted from old cargo vessels. A large number of these fighters were destroyed in the war against the Dominion, but they gave as good as they got in most cases and were quite useful in engaging the smaller Dominion ships. It is believed that production of these tiny vessels will be slowed down with the end of the war, but production will continue.
Even though these ships carried warp drives, these vessels were not as fast as large vessels in the fleet, and were not meant for interstellar missions having a top emergency speed of 7.2. But normal cruising speed was warp 4.8 and a flanking speed was 5.6. However, despite the small size, it was occasionally used by both the Maquis and the Federation for some limited interstellar missions. Of course, in most cases, the vessel was operated from either a starbase or larger starship. These ships do have a very powerful impulse engine, however, that makes them quite agile in normal combat. They're also very capable with an atmosphere setting, and this made them quite effective at ground strikes as well. Top atmospheric speed was around Mach 8.2.
These ships were better protected than their predecessors, having heavier shields and armor. Even so, these ships are extremely fragile when compared to the larger capital ships, and normally one direct hit from a capital ship will disable or destroy a warp fighter. As a result, the fighters constantly maneuver to avoid being hit. The fighter is designed to hit back and is armed with twin powerful phasers on the wingtips, along with micro-torpedo launchers capable of carrying 12 micro-torpedoes. These mini or micro torpedoes are very useful against both fighters and larger vessels. On later versions of the design, the wingtip phasers were replaced by pulse phasers. This model number became the PWF-12B. But its real surprise is that it can in fact carry up to 6 full-size photon or quantum torpedoes under its wing on torpedo hardpoints. These were launched by simply releasing the clamps and allowing the torpedo to self-track to target. In tactical use, these fighters are normally deployed in large groups or squadrons and perform torpedo strikes against much larger vessels. Combined with its agility, the ship in well-trained hands, as well as working in groups, can indeed be a very dangerous opponent.
I know in many video games I've certainly sent bombers in, and just that initial barrage of torpedoes, devastating. I hadn't thought they could do that, so I'm... Ouch. Most famously in canon, there were Federation attack fighters or attack ships that, while looking like Paragons, may have indeed been smaller in design and build. It was never really specified. However, these were likely the early prototype designs stolen by the Maquis. They were in fact a little smaller than the final Paragon design. These were small, maneuverable, and heavily armed vessels, and were primarily used to carry out assaults that larger vessels, such as the Galaxy-class ships, could not perform. The Maquis acquired some of these ships from Starfleet and used them as attack fighters against the Galactic Union. This attack fighter was capable of carrying an impressive arsenal. When used by Starfleet, the ships had several forward torpedo launchers and at least one phaser bank with 2 forward emitters.
When used by the Maquis in 2370, the fighters were armed with whatever weapons were available. Weapons including photon torpedoes, pulse cannons, ship-mounted high-energy disruptors, and particle accelerators were among some of the weapons used. A large number of these Federation fighters were also assigned to protect Earth during the Dominion War. Some saw action when several of these fighters scrambled to engage Breen fighters that had entered Earth's atmosphere during the Breen Assault in late 2375.
The size of the Federation fighter varies, but is halfway consistent at about 25 meters or less. If we discount the wings and engines, the usable internal volume of the fighter can't be much more than the inside of a smaller shuttlecraft, which is quite consistent with how fighter craft, even from today's modern military.
Next, we will look at the Valkyrie class. These were a small starship or fighter design that represented a new model of Federation strike craft introduced into Starfleet service shortly after the Dominion War in the 24th century. These attack ships were designed to work in conjunction with the Typhoon-class carriers introduced around the same time. The first testing of the design came in the early part of 2377.
Early on, 3 training and testing prototypes were in use. They were armed with twin Type 10 phasers, preset to pulse mode, and each carried a single torpedo launcher. Although normally carrying 10 torpedoes, each fighter could load special modules via tractor beam to load probes or other specialized torpedoes as needed. This modularity did carry over to the final design for the Valkyrie, and later several variants of the design were gradually developed.
These variants include the Orca class, which was a small, lightly shielded, and highly agile fighter. The hull follows the general design of shuttlecraft with 2 wings for atmospheric flight that narrow sharply. Then the Griffin class, which was a fragile but heavily shielded and faster fighter. The general shape vaguely resembled some Romulan fighters. And finally the Scarab class, which was a slower fighter with moderate shields and a stronger hull.
But now getting back to the Valkyrie, the original Valkyrie and its development process. The first production model was the Mark I, a heavily modified Talon-class Federation mission scout ship. The standard armament was the usual medium-range twin, Type 10 pulse phasers, a nose-mounted Type 9 phaser for close-range sustained fire, and a special pressor beam to shove targets away. Valkyries were also armed with a standard load of 10 quantum torpedoes and 10 photon torpedoes. I'm just going to break script here for a second. That's a hell of an improvement from the TOS stuff.
Oh yeah, bigger ships.
Yeah.
A little bit more.
Yeah. And a forward-facing tractor beam that swiveled after towing. Later, a forward-mounted compression phaser was added, as well as gravitic mines. Next, the Mark II variants, dubbed the Valor class, were introduced after several weeks. With much larger forward-pointing nacelles, these heavily armoured fighters traded the Type 9 phasers for alternating pulse phasers and added a cloaking device. Red-trimmed Mark IIB versions kept the pulse phasers, quantum torpedoes, and gravitic mines, but replaced the Type 10 phasers with polaron beams and trilithium warheads.
The final Mark III model was introduced 4 to 6 months later and utilized biotechnology. The sleek, curved Y-shaped hull reached forward from the cockpit to 2 arcing nacelles bracketing the hull. The extensive weapons loadout included disruptors, pulse disruptors, polaron beams, and a standard compression phaser. Quantum torpedoes were replaced with proto-matter missiles, and the gravitic mines were upgraded to trilithium. The final red-trimmed 3B version had additional gravitic mines and a special antimatter salvo to supplement the phasers. Some specialized versions upgraded by their pilots included stun weaponry, a holographic decoy system, plasma bursts, photonic missiles, and enhanced versions of the pulse phasers and trilithium warheads, as well as a vastly upgraded explosive torpedo yield.
These sound incredibly powerful.
Indeed.
My goodness. And these are all from Invasion, the video game.
Yeah.
As we've seen over the years of Trek, there have been numerous different designs of smaller craft, or fighter-like craft, in Star Trek, in use by Starfleet or the Maquis. And in games like Starfleet Battles, all races have many fighters of varying designs, from the Klingons to the Gorns, the Romulans, the Lyrans, the Hydrons, and the Kzinti. Everyone had them. As such, many carrier-type craft existed, and are essentially Star Trek's answer to aircraft carriers. In Starfleet Battles, things like entire fighter squadrons are launched from patrol and stand-type carriers.
Yeah, it's true, actually. The Federation even has F-14s, F-18s, A-10s, and F-16s, just to name a few. All the same names that the U.S. Navy or Air Force currently have. So that's always something I've rather liked about the game, as I'm a huge fan of the modern F-14 Tomcat, as everyone knows. Everything from bombers, huge shuttles bristling with weapons, suicide shuttles packed with explosives and to be used as a last resort weapon, and even mega fighters, which are large standard fighters that are faster, meaner, and tougher. Remote-controlled fighters are even used to keep pilots alive to fight another day, and these have faster launch rates, but lack the range for independent strikes and cannot survive well in dogfight-type situations.
Interesting. And you said suicide fighters. If we're still talking general Starfleet battles, I assume they're not Federation suicide bombers or shuttlecraft.
Yeah, the Federation has suicide shuttles, yes.
Oh, really? Well, I guess they're automated.
They're packed full of explosives, and yeah, they're used as last resort weapon.
Okay, but they're not people, I assume. They're all drone style. Okay, good. And as a result of that, the computer version of this game, called Starfleet Command, has fighters and attack shuttles, just like Starfleet Battle tabletop game that is based on. We do see examples of fighters in canon and on screen too, like we already talked about, from the Marquis to the Federation and Dominion, just to name a few. Such ships as the Paragon and some other variations of fighters can clearly be seen in DS9 battles.
Although those scenes, and even how the ships fare in game, does raise the question,
yes,
against such powerful ships and weapons that populate the Star Trek universe, are they just suicide missions as they get destroyed so easily both in-game and on screen?
Yeah.
This is where, as mentioned, those remote-controlled fighters and such would be very beneficial in some strategic environments as a way of keeping your pilots alive, mainly. I know they would all have their place and purpose. For instance, tangling with other small fighters in small skirmishes only involving 2 ships. The big ships could deal with one another, while the fighter squadrons could tangle with each other, and then any survivors could then go on to assist the main capital ship in its defense or even offense against the enemy vessel. So that makes sense. Or even be used in a ground assault role. Attacking enemy assets on the planet's surface while the big ships scrap it out in orbit. I mean, there's uses for all this stuff, but it's a very contentious point because they get blown away so easily.
I can just imagine, though, obviously you need a very good pilot. In a scene, where you're attacking a Galore class, it only has certain phaser or Paragon beam metals, I believe it has. If you have 20 fighters and they're good enough pilots to avoid these beams, every beam that is towards them and not towards the Galaxy class that, say, is their carrier, that is more and more shields for the full battle. If every hit you can take away from them, that, but with pilots, it's sort of... And that raises the question, we see these fighters in the large scale battles in DS9 just get picked off by the large cavalry ships in one phaser hit. That seems like a massive, unbelievable waste of personnel and resources. I mean, fighter pilots must be suicidal. How Federation utopian is that? And just to know, very likely they might die. And some races that might be honourable. Some races. But then, ethically, would it be right for the Federation to just send their pilots to their death, knowing very possibly they might have destroyed, and just how easy tissue paper being ripped through, and does that even balance out the small amount of damage these ships could inflict? I personally don't think so. And while listen to this episode with you, Stuart, I mean the firepower is kind of incredible, and I mean quantums do a lot of damage, but at the same time, ripping through tissue paper, pilot training within Starfleet would need to be highly specialised and require some time to even complete before they can earn their wings. Then to be deployed, perhaps only to be sent on one mission in battle, might not come back. That seems like such a waste. Although, it certainly would be interesting to follow a Starfleet pilot's career through the normal tour of duty and see just exactly what would be involved. Could make for an interesting show premise, but I do think it would change the dynamic, because I completely agree with everything you've written here. The firepower doesn't stack up.
Well, we'll have a discussion about that a little bit later.
Yes.
Star Trek Top Gun. I can just see it now. Anyway. And to be fair, Gene Roddenberry's universe is really dominated by powerful weapons and heavy defensive systems that would seem to logically render fighters as we know them effectively useless in battle.
And especially if you consider JJ Verse and the Axanar pulse phasers throwing punishment out there, I mean, even less effective.
Yeah, and those are, point defense weapons, exactly. Yeah. The main remaining use for a fighter would be as a scout ship of sorts for long-range patrols, far from the mothership, to extend sensor capabilities, which seems to make sense. It also makes sense that these ships would be armed in case of any run-ins with the unknown, so essentially a fighter, small craft, right? Also, escort duties, keeping smaller unarmed shuttles safe, seems to make sense, as well as planetary assaults on ground targets.
It also makes sense that small craft, such as the Burrell, had only a dozen different officers and crew, and be the most logical version of a fighter craft, that you would see in Star Trek. Small enough, but still a scout class vessel with sufficient armament and shielding to at least stand a small chance against other larger ships. We've seen Burrell being blown away, but also survive, so they can do quite a lot. Also, small ships operating in formations or squadrons could be somewhat effective against larger ships, as small vessels could simply swarm the enemy vessels and attack from multiple vectors at once, causing confusion, hopefully knocking out critical systems. And we just saw in Star Trek Beyond, obviously, swarm ships, also very effective. So, that strategy, maybe.
Yeah. It seems almost like the place for fighters and carriers would be in a universe where energy shields aren't present, though, or at
Yes.
least have limited effect.
Yes.
In such a universe, fighters would seem to have some kind of tactical advantage, much like we see in Battlestar Galactica or Star Wars, which translates to the perfect use of a carrier and fighter-based ships. So it is clear that fighters do actually exist in Trek, despite almost not fitting into the Trek universe mold at all, really. It seems inconceivable that any fighter would be able to scratch a ship's shields in Trek, much less survive even one direct phaser blast.
Yeah.
Until we get to the Paragons with the quantum torpedo hardpoints on the wings, that is. I mean, that's where the discussion part of the show comes in, because I always thought, too, that once the main capital ship has used its phasers to get the enemy's shields down, you launch those fighters that have the quantums on them. Quantums are designed for hitting a ship, or torpedoes are after the shields are down. So that's perfect. Launch them, fire a bunch of quantums at an unshielded ship, and then get back into the ship.
Yeah, I mean, at some point you can't hit them all, and especially, you know, there are. I mean, every ship has a weak firing arc. You know, the main capital ship attacks, and you can imagine. You know, I think my way for a fighter, the quantums are the best idea. Take a Paragon, ignore the phasers. Don't give it that sort of weaponry in a sense. Use the space for phasers for shields. Give it as high as strength shields, a blade of armor. Design it so it can survive 1 or 2 hits, and give it the quantums on the wings. So, like you say, the Galaxy class warps in, fires phasers, takes the heat, gets them really engaged. Fighters launch, take the lowly defended area, fast torpedoes. I mean, even if it does shields up, hey, 6 quantums, 10 fighters. I mean, that amount of quantums is going to rip through shields and cause massive damage, possibly disable the ship.
And you don't need torpedo launchers on the ship to be doing that, because you can launch maybe 2 or 3 at a time from a tube. Whereas the hard points, you just let go of the clamps and let all of them drop and go.
I mean, theoretically, these ships, while we say, you know, the 10,000 kilometer range for all these phasers, it gets less and less effective because they can't really have that practical range in a firefight, you know. So I'm sure torpedoes are self-guided. I mean, look at Star Trek 6. They fire a torpedo, it goes off and I mean, we don't know how far that was, but it's clearly far enough. So why not launch the fighters, you know, dogfight a bit, and then just launch torpedoes, you know, move out of the way, even dock back in. I mean, mobile torpedo platforms are very useful, and I don't, you know, it'd be interesting to see. But I've always found that interesting in Dominion War battles. I mean, I guess they are sort of there to also attack the Hidekis and the bug ships. I mean, we've seen the you know, a runabout be able to successfully destroy both a bird of prey and a bug ship. So there are obviously weaknesses in torpedoes, like I say. And I mean, I'm sure, you know, this ship, a multi-purpose ship is designed for more things. You give a Paragon, if you just say, you know, 2 people are in it, give it high yield phaser, it can beat this in phaser power. And if that can be a bug ship, hey, maybe one of these can just rip through a bug ship. Focused, you know, make it just a phaser platform, just a torpedo platform, send it in. I just don't see Starfleet sending in them as suicide people. I mean, just the risk. I mean, losing 5 pilots per engagement is, you know, the Dominion War, they lost, you know, 400 in one ship. I mean, come on, that one scene, the famous scene where 2 Mirandas get blown up defending the Defiant. I mean, that's 800 people just killed there. Whereas, you know, you send 50 fighters out, they've got nowhere near that. So, I mean, in the scale of war, why wouldn't you send fighters? I mean, you're going to already lose hundreds of people. Why not have those torpedoes out there? But
that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, like we kind of mentioned, there are places for fighters in the Trek universe, as far as I'm concerned. I don't see them as being a whole squadron of ships going in, like a DS9 battle. You see the Federation ships coming in. I can't see them launching the fighters right away. I think the fighters are like after the battle's been going on for a while. You've got weak, vulnerable enemy targets.
Yes.
Big ship is taking out a different ship. You launch the fighters to destroy this ship that's already crippled or disabled. That's what I see them doing. Or the shuttle escort was perfect. That kind of role, like have 4 or 5 fighters escorting a shuttle with somebody in it, you know, just to make sure it's at least protected and armed a little bit. And ground assault. I mean, so I can see it, but at the same time, I'm not really. I love the idea of fighters in Trek because I've used them in Starfleet battles and they are useful.
Yes.
But when you watch it on screen and it's like one hit and they're gone, you're like, wait a minute, that's not right.
I remember, you know, I'll go back to Starfleet battles in a second, but in Starfleet Command, you know, you sent out shuttles and fighters, they didn't do anything. You know, they last a few minutes, maybe, you know, in your battle.
The one thing they were good for was shooting that plasma torpedoes that were headed towards your ship to decrease their power, their yield, and also taking out like drones and any other weapons that are like photon torpedoes. You can also kind of take some damage off with phaser effects and stuff. So as far as that goes, protecting the main ship, kind of, I get it. It's possible.
So they're kind of their own pulse defense system, in essence.
Yeah. They're exactly.
Well, how did you feel knowing the sort of Star Trek lore when you were playing Star Trek battles with your brother and such? Were you seeing it very much like modern day fighter craft escort, or did you think that fit in the Trek universe? And then now, how do you feel having known that the universe sort of says that's not a thing? I mean, do you feel sort of like hard done by because in your world they're so obviously?
When I was young, it made sense. I pictured it like a sea battle where the big ships were duking it out, and the fighters went up and they took care of the other fighters, and then maybe did a bombing run on the enemy's main ship, something like that. But then that was before Deep Space Nine came out, obviously. Then you see these epic space battles where you see these small ships, even Bird of Prey's, one shot gone, and those are not small ships, really. You see things like that, and you wonder what is the practicality of that kind of thing. Because I certainly wouldn't want to be a fighter pilot, getting launched into that kind of battle and going, I'm not coming back, guys, but okay, let's do what we can do here.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the debate, and I don't think we're going to sort it out now. You're obviously for it. Either way, I mean, obviously I learned so much. Just the description of how powerful these. I love Valkyries. I love all that stuff. I mean, description of how much they can do. Certainly pulls me closer to it's acceptable, and I love the Typhoon class. It warp in, launch. I mean, imagine if launched hundreds of fighters, and they were either automated. Because I mean, why not have people in the Typhoon class in a one of those chairs controlling it?
I mean, simulator.
Rather than being a drone ship, why not be? Well, I guess they are drones too. Rather than being AI controlled, why not the carrier control the ships? And then suddenly you've got 200 fighters flying with quantums. I mean, that would be. I would run away. I mean, even one quantum each, I would happily warp out of there. 9.95. So I think Star Trek is at a point where they're going post-design. They probably could make that, and it would certainly reflect our contemporary unpiloted drones, but still piloted. That'd be an interesting discussion. Could you imagine if there was a scene where even a Defiant comes in, and then 50 shuttles, 50 whatevers come in, and then 50 of them get destroyed, 30 of them get destroyed, but they say no losses, and we've destroyed this. Oh wow, how much damage did you do?
Waste of resources and time, like to build.
That's true. That's true.
See, for me, it works way better in Battlestar Galactica and Star Wars universe because there's such minimal shields on any of those ships, and. Yeah, so. Well, that's it for today, guys. Obviously, fighters do appear in Trek canon, but the argument over whether or not they actually should, I think, will continue, especially in the comments below. The battle begins down below. Be a fighter pilot. Go do your thing. As we have said, there are many other fighters from other side canon that can be looked at and examined, but we will do those at some other point in time, perhaps in mission briefing style. Might be fun.
Yeah.
Anyway, guys, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And we will see you all next time. This is Captain Foley.
And Commander Coggins.
Saying, see you later. Bye, everybody. Pilot.